Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today's a special episode. It's a Q&A episode. We call it Answers Without Organs. We took some of your questions on our social media accounts or on our Patreon account, and here we are today to answer those questions in a very informal kind of setting. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's supporting us in all the different kinds of ways, whether that's retweeting stuff that we tweet on Twitter, or if it's being a Patreon supporter, which now at this point we have exactly 50 patrons as I mentioned this. The question is, can we make that 50 more? You can subscribe to us for as little as $1, and for the rest of the year, that's like less than $5 or $6 at this point. So hop on board with us. Okay, let's get to your questions. This was a lot of fun, so we're just going to pop right into the discussion. I just started the recording, so maybe we can get started with some of these questions for our Q&A. So the first question, well, there's actually two questions here that we can combine into one. The first is from One Dime. It says, what affordable universities or colleges do you recommend which have good professors and postgraduate programs, PhD and or MA, for studying critical theory and more radical continental philosophy? And then also we have Tadbert Scraping. They're asking a question about, is the institution of the university salvageable in any sense when it comes to radical thought? Meaning, is the university a radical center? Is it sufficient to put forth radical ideas and actualize them in any meaningful way? So who wants to take that one first?
Well, I can have a go at the universities bit first. I can speak to at least some of the ones in the UK at least. Maybe Craig or Will could speak to the US. But in terms of critical theory and continental philosophy, that sort of area, my understanding is that the most sort of respected universities would probably include Warwick in particular. I know Sussex and Essex both have some really, really great writers and thinkers there. Fabian Freinhagen has done some amazing work on Adorno's ethics in particular. And then there's some in London too, like Birkbeck and Goldsmiths, obviously. My understanding is it's basically a mixture of primarily Warwick, Sussex and Essex for sort of continental.
Two more there in particular. So another good one for continental philosophy is Royal Holloway, which is technically a University of London, but it's relatively far out. There you've got a lot of the Deleuze, great Deleuzean thinkers. You've got Nathan Withers there. You've got Henry Summers Hall, who did Hegel, Deleuze, Critique of Representation. That was quite good. And as I don't know if Matt was setting me up for this, but there's also got the Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy in Kingston in London. That is has its own critical theory MA. Lots of good scholars there. Really in-depth courses. Yes, I do go there. I am selling it.
I was kind of setting you up there, yeah. Have a plug for it.
No other place I've been to where you can go to a Hegel class and read the whole phenomenology in one course. It's intense as fuck, but you're not going to have that chance a lot. And really sort of good scholarship going on there. You got Etienne Balabar, Pete Hallwood, Catherine Malibu, Stella Sanford, Howard Kay, got like loads of cool people going there. Peter Osborne, it's a really sort of good all round set now. Eric Alias, who studied with Deleuze, that is my favorite place to go. Continental philosophy. I went there for 2 degrees.
Sure.
But coming back to the point about the function of the university,
yeah,
I don't think it's a radical center so much necessarily as it can be a radical incubator or an incubator of radical programs, because one of the things that the university has as a kind of holdover as it's going into the neoliberal era is a lot of resources and the ability to spend money on things that aren't necessarily productive in the neoliberal worldview, especially where there are philosophy departments, even though in places like the UK they are getting shut down quite often. But I think you can definitely tap into that resource pool to really build radical projects, build radical side reading groups. Of course, this requires itself not grants and maintenance loans and something that a privilege isn't available to everyone, but
sure.
I think there is definitely a space for working in this. And even, para-academia is still quite, a large and very well proliferative thing. Eventually, if we're going to have Matt Colquhoun on, who's done some incredible para-academic outside of the academy, working on Mark Fisher's work and his own philosophy on his blog. So I think it's not necessarily as a radical space, but it's definitely a place where you can incubate radical ideas.
I think that's important. I want to provide maybe some American context, because I don't know where our listeners calling in from. And the really important part there for me, when I read that question, was affordable. One thing you really have to be clear about when you go into these programs is really know what you're getting into financially. And the hardest thing is going to be affordability. And in fact, in the United States, that's where I would put my pressure when making a decision. There are some great programs. The New School is a great program. It's expensive. So the reality is, when it comes to an education, a center for theory, it's going to come down to whether or not you can come into your own there. Yes, it matters if, a Deleuzean scholar is teaching there and you study Deleuze and you want to be with that professor or so on. But the real question is going to be, are these people going to be sort of amenable to your interests? And that would be the one thing that I look for. The one thing I would be nervous about would be programs that are very analytical. I know a bunch of the New York State universities are very analytical in their orientation. Stony Brook here in New York isn't, but a few of them are. That would be the thing I look for when it comes to, affordable programs. All of the state schools, in a sense, are going to be affordable. It's going to be a question of whether or not, or more affordable, but it's going to be a question of what are the opportunities on campus to do research work, to TA, and that varies widely campus to campus. Those are the bits of advice that I would give. To the question of radicals in academia, I know that David Graeber, who unfortunately passed away a few days ago, an article of his was being circulated about marketing in the university. And he essentially said that the university is sort of collapsing into an almost scholastic institution that provides endless footnotes to Deleuze, Foucault, Baudrillard, Lyotard, so on, despite knowing full well that were they to manifest in the contemporary era, they'd be denied tenure. So when it comes to radical theory, Western University out of Ottawa, they have a theory center, and you can look at the MA theses and dissertations, and you can get an idea of the kind of work those students are doing. I looked at it for a little while, and it's that sort of research. I can't give particular programs. I can tell you which ones are very pricey. The New School, and I think that there are great academic opportunities out there, but it's not about finding an environment that immediately suits all of your needs. It's about knowing that you're going to have the institutional support as you change as a student, which you should and will.
Yeah. Also, in terms of the affordability, just to add to that, you should, have a person who wrote in, or to anyone who's also interested in this, spend a lot of time looking into what sort of scholarships, bursaries, studentships, what are available, right, and just apply for as many as you possibly can, because ultimately these many of them are sort of private institutions, and there's this kind of cost which you have to take on board going in. But through something like a studentship, you might be able to minimize that, and and then get in and find your niche, find your that room you want to explore, this interesting theory, I guess. And just also add that in terms of universities and radical theory or politics, I think one of the main things that university does, and why it's not really a coincidence that many of the most radical movements, since sort of mid 20th century, were students. It's that it gives you a space where once you're in and once you're sort of stable, it gives you the room to think and to meet new people and to encounter new ideas and new lifestyles and new movements or whatever, and to be able more or less, obviously people have different circumstances, but more or less than outside of university, more ability to just to spend time in that kind of milieu, I suppose. That's why David Graeber, had a lot of great things to say about his time with student politics a lot of time, the radical side of it anyway. it's funny if you go and like look at some of the people who are talking about the times they were doing like sit-ins and things with him in London when they were his students. Like many of these are now really public, high-profile radical writers and thinkers and media personalities or whatever. You know, they started a lot of that, got a lot of the starting point, I suppose, from their time as students. So I think there's still a possibility there. Yeah, there's that constant issue with financialization of universities. And
I guess my answer is going to be the anti-answer to this question. And I'm also not going to presuppose that everybody who's listening to this wants to go to a PhD program or an MA program, maybe because they think they cannot. And I'm somebody, I had my undergrad degree in philosophy, of course, and then I went on to do other and different things. And I got to a point in my life where I thought, well, I'm kind of too old to get into a PhD program or even any sort of graduate program. And of course, that was false. I was teaching at a university, not philosophy, but in virtue of doing so, I was able to take classes that would basically take me to an MA in philosophy for free. And so while I was working there, I was just taking whatever classes were offered at night. And then when I stopped working at the university, then now I had to pay for these classes. And maybe, as you know, as part of my side work, I'm a musician. I was doing gigs in Las Vegas and using that money to pay for the rest of school. And that's basically how I made it through my master's program. Along the way, it was interesting because I'm a little bit older, working adult. I was able to interact with people who were younger than me and see what their concerns were and what the horizon for prospects, either in PhD programs and or jobs, look like. One of the things that came up was, and this wasn't necessarily the case when I was an undergrad, is that a lot of PhD programs aren't even looking at students unless you have exceptional grades or an exceptional CV of some sort. Until you have an MA. So one of the things to think about is where can you get your MA for cheap? So I live in California. I went to a CSU school for my MA, and that was a great experience. And now we're talking about radical thought. If you're thinking, well, how can I get into a radical philosophy program? My advice is don't. Go into an MA program first.
Exactly.
That's going to be like an enhanced undergraduate program. Get a lot of analytic philosophy. Get philosophy of science. Do some socio-political. And then from there, you know what your interests are. That's your thesis. Lock into somebody there that you can work with. Now you're getting all these skills. So then when you finally get into your PhD program, working on your specialty, you have this whole other set of skills.
Yeah, I think that's right. I will say that it is getting tougher in the U.S. I'll just throw some programs other than Cal State. San Francisco State University is a great MA. They have their students also, they get teaching experience and so on. So, if you need those sorts of merit badges, go for it. That's a good place to do it. And look for those sorts of opportunities everywhere.
So let's move on maybe. Let's go to our other questions that we have here. The first comes from one of our patrons, Abe. Comrade Abe says, he has a few questions, and I'm directing the first one at Adam. And his question is about Deleuze and Guattari. He says, what do Deleuze and Guattari bring to philosophy that moved the conversation along?
I mean, yeah, I'm going to come toward this question from a position of someone who's not as big or as research into Deleuze and Guattari as everyone else on the panel here. But what I found them incredibly striking when I first started to read them, because I was coming it from seemingly, at least from where they was putting it from, a very opposite side of the magnet, so to speak, from Hegelianism. And the idea of thinking about things from this other side of positivity, of differentiation, was something I never really considered before. For example, the whole entire reconfiguration of desire as productive rather than as something lacking, which is, the sort of trope you get if you move through sort of Hegelian studies in towards, Zizek and the sort of the big Lacanian school, which dominates a lot of sides of that sort of discourse, where Deleuze is sort of maybe sometimes left behind a bit after books like Zizek's Organs About Body. And that was something I thought moved conversation forward quite a bit, especially historically, through if you want to trace continental theory from the Free Ages, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, then suddenly we get the injection of Freud, and suddenly you have this psychoanalytic turn going forward, and eventually is totally flips it on its head when it comes to the notion of design and the notion of the unconscious. And the second thing I would say that really sort of flipped it for me was the breaking down of Oedipalization, of this rigid, assumed categorization of the only certain certain patterns which we try to fit all sort of unconscious or psychological motifs into. It's sort of a breaking, it's a rapid sort of explosion of the sort of possibilities. You think, well, actually, like with how Deleuze and Guattari interpret little hands. Maybe I don't have to interpret this according to the textbooks. Maybe I can actually trace these little desires, these flows somewhere else. And I really enjoyed that breaking free. It is really an example in the sense of Anti-Oedipus smoothing out the familial striated space of Freudian psychoanalysis and seeing what abstract possibilities pop up.
So the next question, I actually have an answer for, but I'll just put it out to you guys first. And this is from Abe again. We'll do one more of his questions. When speaking about difficult concepts from Dullus and Gattari, what do you find is the most difficult one for people to pick up? Or maybe what was the most difficult one for you to pick up?
It was probably antiproduction, which comes out of Anti-Oedipus. I think part of the reason why I struggled was my formulation of power, and I had really just started to begin my foray into Foucault for my undergrad thesis. So I hadn't yet understood sort of these alternative notions of power, suppression, and so forth. So when I saw anti-production, I sort of just took it as a production of forces that are just meant to like repress, which is obviously not correct. And I hung on to that for a while. It wasn't until, deep into this, I'm going to use the word foray again, into this that I started to see that maybe the very nature of my approach to Deleuze was incorrect. I think that was sort of the beginning of my reassessment of capitalism and schizophrenia. So I would say that I struggled mostly with anti-production and sort of the unconscious is that can operate as a recording space too. These are all really, really complicated concepts that are touched on only early in Anti-Oedipus and then are sort of dropped. And you're sort of expected to get where they're going. You have to speak their language. And that can be frustrating. I think that's a legitimate critique of that text, is that sometimes it doesn't do enough legwork. But I think fundamentally it's necessary to do that work early on, which was why I think the Deleuze and Guattari reading groups that popped up this summer were just great.
My answer would probably be the body without organs. The good thing, though, of course, is that Craig has recorded an episode about At Horizon where he explains that one as well. So that anyone who's interested in understanding that concept can just go have a look at that one.
I think the body without organs is probably one of the hardest ones because it has so many different kinds of meanings throughout. If you go from 1,000 Plateaus to Mille Plateau, and I ended up just having to describe it as a kind of circuit breaker or stopgap at some point. You really had to tie it into the logic of disjunction, and I couldn't understand it without reading someone like Holland's book on Deleuze and Guattari. That's probably it's always the hardest one, and it's always the one most in demand, so it's a pain in the bloody ass.
Right.
I guess I could talk more about the body without organs, but just go check that episode. It's all there. Aside from the body without organs, a tough one for me was to get their notion of abstract machine. And if you go into, for example, if you look at Janosko's Deleuze and Guattari dictionary, or at least the one that he's on. I don't know if he does the entry for abstract machine. Actually, Eugene Young does. That was a tough one because admittedly, Deleuze and Guattari are working with these concepts and adapting them across different books, like Adam said. And so in the Kafka book, they refer to an abstract machine as a machine that's basically motivated by a transcendent signifier, something that purportedly stands outside the immanent sphere of whatever's being produced within it. And that's different than other uses. I actually had to work on that one quite a bit because my master's thesis was on Kafka's Before the Law, which is typical of what they consider an abstract machine in the Kafka book. And so I guess we'll do one more of Abe's questions. He said, if you had to choose 2 books to be stranded on an island with for several years, what would they be? And we'll start with Matt.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a little bit recently because I have this bad habit of kind of dipping into books rather than sort of reading them from the first page to back all the way through. It's a bad habit, but I think I'd probably Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals would be a strong contender, because I feel like every time you read that book, you get something different from it. On top of that, maybe I'm still a big fan of Zizek's Sublime Object of Ideology. Honestly, I'm not particularly partisan in the whole like Deleuze-Lacan debate or discourse or whatever, and that was a huge book for me in terms of getting me interested in critical theory, I guess, or critical philosophy. So yeah, maybe something like Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, Sublime Object of Ideology, although I've still got a soft spot for Schmitt's concept of political as well, as a kind of... It's one of those texts which challenges a lot of ideas, a lot of our received ideas about what politics is. So yeah, I'll probably stick with the first two.
Adam, what about you?
Well, the first one's going to be Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the 1977 Oxford edition, because that is, yeah, exactly. There are still some parts of that book I don't get. There are still some parts of it, the very poetry of the stuff on the religion of art and, the absolute knowing is still always going to be great with me. And also, because it's got the commentary with Jay and Finley at the back, I can argue with someone else while I'm on the island.
Right.
The second one, I was thinking of doing a theory one like Thus Spake Zarathustra, or maybe, I don't know, Meal Plateau, so I could actually get into it. But I think I would need something more poetic just to keep myself marginally sane, or even if I go off the rails a bit, I can at least use the Hegel text and the poetry to start my own kind of personal religion. So I would have gone for something like a collection of the German Romantics. So probably Hölderlin, Novalis. Hölderlin, Novalis. Okay. I'll go with collective either that collective works of Hölderlin, or I'll go for the Oxford Book of Modern Verse, which W.B. Yeats put in, which has some great stuff by like Rabindranath Tagore and G.K. Chesterton and opposite Yeats, and yeah, poetry and phenomenology.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go next because I'm basically stealing from Adam. It'd probably be Thus Spoke Zarathustra and maybe 1,000 Plateaus, because I don't know that as well as I know Anti-Oedipus. And so if we're talking several years, what is that, 10 years? Sure, I'll do it. But there are some honorable mentions. Maybe just take the Freud reader out there, just go through all Freud stuff, because I'd like to know that a lot better. And then I do need like the sort of like poetic thing. Maybe I would take like the Tao Te Ching out there just to kind of smooth everything out, or the Upanishads or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I thought about this for a while. One of my questions back was, am I to survive on this island? But given the nature of, because if it was that, it would just be the full set of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and then I just use it as Tinder to start fires.
Oh, better.
But or just like just a full body of like Marx's works, not so that I have at least enough sustenance. But now that it's for leisure and education, I mean, big surprise, one of the texts will be by Foucault, but it'll be History of Madness, the recent Routledge publication, just a few years old. And then probably Faust. Those two texts would be what I bring, and the reason is frankly because I've never read it, and for the History of Madness to just dive into that Foucault-Derrida debate about unreason. And its inaccessibility. And madness as an inaccessible realm of thought is something that fascinates me when we look at the history of ideas. Part of what Foucault does in the History of Madness and Civilization is showing sort of the epistemological limits of any given age. And I think that that's essential to sort of get burnt down in my head for the way that I want to engage with philosophy in a sort of archival sense sometimes. Because I think methodologically there's a lot to say about that text. And I know that's like generic considering like I'm the Foucault guy on this podcast, but whatever.
I mean, at least you didn't say Fanged Noumena.
Oh, please.
Oh, God. Oh, God. No, I'd want to go mad. I'd want to go mad reading about Neo-China and, it hacking my Xeno data.
The question is, am I cutting this part of the episode out? Probably not.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
No, you leave that in, because when we say fuck Nicoland, we mean it.
I'm actually going to change my answer. I'm actually going to change one of the two I gave. instead of Zizek's Sublime Logic of Ideology, I would probably go for Adorno's Minima Moralia.
Okay.
Because it's it's one of the most beautiful pieces of philosophy ever written, in my opinion, but also it's so dense and full of ideas. I mean, one page of that book is the equivalent of 100 pages of most other writers, I think.
We should absolutely dedicate an episode to just you walking us through Adorno. I like, and now I feel a little bit more comfortable because I'm at home. The Hegelian has picked the phenomenology of spirit. Matt, you've picked the Frankfurt School, and I'm right at home with my boy Michel.
Yeah.
So
here's a question, and I think I'll shoot this at Will first. It's from Tesla, Indigenous Lives Matter. What relationship does philosophy hold with mental health for you? And it says, feel free to interpret as you see fit, but I proudly say that this podcast, Acid Horizon, was one of the few things that kept me sane while I was in the psych ward. And I just have to say that I'm really touched to hear that. Maybe, Will, you could say something.
Yeah, I think philosophy has everything to do with the way we understand mental health. Philosophy can mean a lot to people subjectively. So I guess I won't answer it that way, right? Because somebody can find sort of deep personal meaning in philosophy. And I often look to Sartre for that, as my sort of personal guide. But when it comes to mental health, since we were just talking about madness and civilization, Foucault kind of gives this description of Cartesian dualism as being something that arises out of that discourse. And I think your approach to the philosophical foundations or presuppositions of any given psychological framework is going to tell you a lot about either that breed of psychology, that breed of psychoanalysis. But I want to focus on the personal a little bit here, because Tesla, but I do get the intensity of that question, and I almost feel unequipped or poorly equipped to answer it. But I'll try, because I think just the detail, and it means a lot to all of us that people are developing sort of a personal relationship, at least to the things that we put out. It was always sort of our goal to make this sort of a thing that people can approach, and we do the best we can. But what I will say is, I'm going to take the Heideggerian perspective on this, and I'm going to say that if a text of philosophy, if you're not dealing with it purely academically, if it's not doing anything for you, it's not worth your time. If it's not changing the way you address the world, if it's not altering the way you feel about something, it's not worth your time. Obviously, everyone should read J.L. Austin, right? If they're trying to understand semiotics. But if those investigations aren't doing anything for you, keep looking. And I think what philosophy has to do with mental health is it has to do with the very presuppositions that you come to the table with when addressing anything in your life. And if philosophy isn't, say, teaching you how to live, teaching you how to address death, and so on, then I don't think it's achieving what it needs to. And look, maybe Nietzsche will sneer at me and say, "You filthy Stoic," or whatever. But philosophy has meant a lot to me because I engaged with it first non-academically, and for that reason, texts by Sartre, which is weird, right? Because I'm the Foucault guy, I bear that cross. My relationship to those texts means something to me very personally. So what philosophy means to mental health, I think, means to the way in which you address your own mental health. I don't know if that's the adequate enough answer, and I really wish I could provide a better one. But that's the best gander I can give.
All right. What about Adam?
Oh God. Well,
It's a tough one.
I don't have anything productive to say, even though I'm saying philosophy has been incredibly bad for mine.
Yeah, sometimes.
The hermeneutics of suspicion are a very useful tool, but not a very good mindset to carry around with you all the time. Having sort of the Nietzschean impulse or the Freudian impulse or the Marxian impulse going, oh, are you sure you think that? Or is it just, oh, you would think that, wouldn't you? Because where did you get that from? Your ideology or your mother or your, the history,
or the axioms of power,
the European
right?
male. I mean, there's a sense in which philosophy has to produce a kind of subject that negative part of philosophy has to stop at some point.
And that's where Deleuze and Guattari come in, right?
Yeah, which is where Nietzsche comes in a sense. Nietzsche solves his own problem in a sense because he philosophizing with a hammer is hitting these idols with a hammer and seeing if they sort of ring in a nice tone. It's not just beating every idol into a hammer, otherwise you never get to the third metamorphosis from aspects of fruit, never gets to the child. And I think, that where sort of the mental health aspects of philosophy can help is coming to a sort of sense of yourself in a kind of, not necessarily always an affirmative way, but in a sense that you can sort of play with your own thoughts and be comfortable in your own thoughts. And even if your own thinking has been disturbed by a philosophy, there's a sense in which you can engage with it in a constructive way that makes sure this negativity isn't always something excluded from your own mind. You can sort of manage negativity, you can tarry with it, as Hegel would say. And I find that something that's eventually quite helpful, to be honest, away from Nietzsche. I quite like Hegel because you could tarry with all these horrible things of absolute negation and death and total oblivion. Then you think eventually you come out at the end of it, you're like, I might be okay. But yeah, so that's by no means as fleshed out as constructive as Conrad Will's point. And I'm very under-equipped for this. My God.
Matt. Yeah, so I think Will did a really good job as well as Adam there. But one thing whenever I think about the relationship between philosophy and mental health, I always end up going back to the chapter in Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism about this, because one of the things I think that's tricky about mental health is a lot of the time there's this drive to kind of individualize it, so that it's a problem which I am, one is confronted with and has to solve through their own individual means, right? Whether that's, get outside more and exercise and, fake it till you make it and so on. Or whether that's, medication and so on. And one of the things I think that can be helpful about philosophy in this area is that is to start treating these questions of mental health as perhaps, at least in many cases, I don't want to be sort of sensitive to the diversity of issues that are out there. At least in many cases, it's quite clear that we can say that there is a kind of social or political structure to this, particularly when we think about some of the most widespread contemporary conditions like depression and anxiety and so on, right? These are issues which arise under certain circumstances, and that those circumstances are determined in many ways politically and socially. And so what that means is that it changes the question back on itself. So it's no longer about what I can do individually. It's about what all of us can do to create a better society where we aren't forced to confront this as a routine part of everyday life in the first place, in my opinion. And that leads you to movements, to communities, to collective action. And that's a far more positive approach, I think. Hopefully that made sense.
If I could pick up on that point with something, I guess, approaches everyone, but the Mark Fisher point is incredibly useful for this, because I was reading what recently came out a couple days ago, the final lectures, and in the third lecture he talks about the act of consciousness raising and the idea that we become conscious of these structures that make people ill, and a priest being individualized, there is a kind of relief there. It's a sense, it's not you're not broken. The system is broken. You have been produced as subjects. You're not responsible for all these kinds of horrible things that have been afflicted on you. You are not a self-causing fonts of suffering. No. This is a systemic practice. This is a practice that has created you, and we have sort of created from a collective project of consciousness raising this new consciousness of the structures and the totality that produces these kind of effects. And I think Mark Fisher is incredibly useful for this, and I think it's great you brought it up.
The thing that I would add is that philosophy, from a mental health perspective, for me, produces a bunch of different, I guess I would say, avatars, almost like little Pokemons. I don't know if I'm going to use the word Pokemon right here, so you guys have to step in. But the way that I think about it is there's a whole toolkit that is imparted along your journey, and the tools do different things. And maybe what I can do is we'll just flash back to 1993 right now. I'm in 10th grade, so you can do the math on that. And I was invited to the prom by a young woman at the time who was 2 years older than me. And in the interim between being invited to the prom and actually going with her, she ended up getting a different boyfriend. And so what happened was there I was listening to Boys II Men play at the prom as I'm milling about the lobby. The next day I'm down at the bookstore and I found, and here it is again, the Tao Te Ching. And this was my entry into the world of philosophy. And at that time, just getting that was just kind of a palliative for that situation, right? So a lot of us as young folks, we have that experience. But then going forward, philosophy just provides you with all kinds of really cool tools. I mean, of course, the critical thinking tools, which works sometimes to offset some of the bullshit that you deal with, right, on a daily basis. Also, I think just being engaged with the rigorous discourse of philosophy allows you to sidestep things that aren't worth your time and detect chatter and nonsense, or the unuseful kind of nonsense anyway, that just eats up your time and your mental bandwidth.
Right.
And so, go ahead, Will.
No, it's just, it's funny because, in a certain sense, my exposure to political philosophy was through debate. And then because I wasn't a philosophy student, my exposure to sort of ontology, phenomenology, whatever, was just through personal interest. And because of that, I think the Tao Te Ching example is brilliant. The reason why we all come to this can be so different. For some of us, it's an academic pursuit that's fulfilling. For some of us, it's sort of a personal drive that we're given an itch in a debate round or something. And then for some of us, it's because our high school girlfriend at the time, did this or that. And I think all of that shows sort of the grand subjectivity that this that comes with this literature. But two, the reason why I think the political is particularly important is because, as Mark Fisher said, this can't be something, boiled down to, I think it's something suffered privately by damaged individuals. And it's those sorts of totalities, right? Someone who is sick, someone who is this or that I think philosophy forces you to move beyond, or I personally think philosophy that's worth pursuing moves beyond that.
Craig was talking about, philosophy's capacity to help us to filter out, a lot of the noise, I guess, and make us, evaluate what things do we care about, what matters to us. And I just wanted to recommend, there's a very good book by Jenny Odell called How to Do Nothing. I would say, the title doesn't do it justice entirely. It's a very good book. In the first chapter, she references Deleuze, Franco Bifo Berardi, and a few others. And it's all about the ways in which many of the social issues we're dealing with today do have, social and political roots, and that it's going to be a matter of political action that changes these things. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that book because it's really good.
Cool. Let's do some more questions. Here's a question. I think this is a trap, this question. I think I know the way to get out of this trap. But 1,000 Ozark Plateaus says, what is the correct order in which one should read Mille Plateaux?
Okay, I have an answer for this one.
Okay,
Definitive.
do it.
Okay, so you got to treat it a bit like Anti-Oedipus, right? And you don't read the preface first. You read the preface after the end of the book, right? Okay, and then you go to the introduction. And then consciousness. Then self-consciousness. Then reason. Then spirit in its parts, ethical order, culture, and morality. Then religion. Then absolute knowing. Then you read the science of logic. God. And then you read Anti-Oedipus.
No, like the Jesus Christ, Adam. Jesus. Okay. The answer. I'm going to push back on our listener here. The answer is given to us by Dullus and Gattari. You read it like you would listen to different grooves on a record. I mean, it's. I just don't think there is sort of an answer to that question. But Craig, if you have a crack that you want to give,
no, that's it. Yeah, I mean, they
like,
recommend just dropping in anywhere. I think that the key
anywhere to start reading.
The first one I read was Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal. I don't know about you guys. What was your first plateau?
You always remember your first, don't you?
Yeah.
Postmodernism linguistics. It was awful.
Oh no!
The Stoic references just went all over my head.
Terrible.
We had 2 days to read it.
My first plateau was One or Several Wolves, and I thought it was sick.
And that's a tough one.
Yeah, I really struggled with the Freud in there. But because of that text, I was able to actually garner a better understanding of the body without organs. I feel like I was ahead of the curve when I addressed Anti-Oedipus fully after having read that plateau. Because the way in which Masumi goes about describing the body without organs lines up pretty well with that plateau. And obviously, he's someone you will turn to eventually if you're doing like Deleuze studies. You'll have to. This concept of ontopower and the ontopolitical, I think, are essential and like good post-Deleuzean scholarship. So no, I don't think there is a way to read 1,000 Plateaus unless you're Adam and you're Hegelian and you're coming here to ruin all of our fun. Why did we bring this guy on again?
Exactly.
Because Catherine Mallory once said, "Who's afraid of Hegelian walls?"
I am. There's your answer. I'm afraid.
Maybe the next question. Actually, the next question is from Taylor Adkins of Taylor Adkins fame. He says, how much do you love Taylor Adkins, and or will you record an episode with him on wrestling and semiotics?
See, he didn't send that in. Someone wrote it in French, and he translated it to send it
right. No, I actually think this is a good question. Yes, we love Taylor Adkins. We love him a lot, very much. So much of the work we do is thanks to him. Like I barely speak French, like I'm currently in classes for it. But the WWE thing I'm going to take seriously. I do actually think that there is a lot of really interesting bodily semiotics going on there. And I think there's a lot you could say about the docile bodies chapter and the role that WWE plays and like an actual like Foucauldian deconstruction. I think there's also a lot of later feminist understandings of masculinity and the fragility of that causing sort of gender trouble in the role that WWE and theatrics can play in self-expression and pressing on the edges of like what is entertainment, what is reality, what is violence. So I actually think like not only the semiotics, but here's the thing. I'll do it if we can open the episode with one of those old like 2007 like back of your F-150, with the radio on rock songs. If we open up with like, Craig, I know you can do this. I know you can make one. If you make a wrestling jingle, I will do it. That's my ultimatum.
Kayfabe is a very Foucauldian concept. You're literally regimenting their bodies and they're not leaving out to break it. You can't even be seen together in the same car with someone from the opposite side of the good, evil popularity spectrum. And like, it would be amazing. Yeah,
I'm into it. I think we should look at Roland Barthes' essay in Mythologies. That would be a really good one to go into. Yeah, I'm down.
Yeah, Taylor is our boy. A lot of love there. I think the best way of taking wrestling seriously is by not taking it seriously. But yeah, I think we should do it. I imagine, I bet you Taylor has, like, he's already got half an essay written in his head about this. And he really wants to have a chance to just, throw some thoughts out there. I think that I have no idea what to expect from an episode like that, but that's why it could be quite fun.
I expect a Taylor Adkins style interaction. I expect like a theory talk level engagement. Like we'll be discussing it, and then we'll be on like some random plateau, and I'll be lost. I won't understand anything that's going on, and I'll be like panicking and direct messaging Matt on Discord while the discourse is going on.
Let's do this question. This is from LSD Spinoza. How have your studies of philosophy enabled you to better understand current events? Have you been able to apply particular concepts to make more sense of the increasingly chaotic world around us?
I mean, the easy answer there is that studying philosophy has taught me that basically everything sucks, and that it normally just gets worse over time. And so in that sense, most of the last few years have just been really perfectly explained by it for me. That's the trend, right? Yeah.
I mean, when I was speaking to a friend who works for Amazon, he was describing sort of the problems he has when, for example, they'll be doing their job pretty damn well. They'll have like an amount of packages like stowed away properly, but the problem is that they're being told off for not doing it in the right way. So the Amazon guys have these special moves. For example, they call them the Macarena or the Hadouken. And I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool actually. This is kind of like, well, not kind of cool, but it's really. And I sort of excited explaining it to the guy I was talking to in these sort of Foucauldian terms about regimenting the soldier's body for his arms to be a gun aiming machine, and it's not actually to do with the actual action as much as it is also to do with the controlling and literally forcing them into these patterns of movement. It's like, oh shit, this actually explains everything. And I'm like, well, okay. It's like he said, can you help? Can this stuff help me? And I'm like, you got to look to Marx for that. But yeah, I think there is definitely a space for it. I mean, I am less tempted to go into sort of the more predictive mode of philosophy for sort of very nervous Hegelian reasons. But I mean, understanding the practices of subjectivation are definitely things you can apply to everyday life in terms of
I also think that a lot of this stuff has come into the foreground because of the success of various, or I guess success is the wrong word, so cut that, because of the movements spawned out of a lot of academic understandings of gender expression, race, right? The president of the United States is tweeting about critical race theory, right? That's a direct relationship between Frantz Fanon and now the president of the goddamn United States. And, I know that that's not the great answer. Like, oh, how do I understand, like, the invasion of Afghanistan through, like, Baudrillard? That can be helpful. But I think there's more direct a relationship between philosophy, particularly political philosophy, and contemporary politics than we sometimes like to admit. Like, a lot of the time we will just say, oh, well, Agamben's a fucking maniac, and Judith Butler and all of these other people are just engaging in grievance studies or whatever. But a lot of the time they are proven correct. I mean, specifically, queer theory in the recent years. I know that Andrew Culp will be dealing with this in particular. A section of his book will be on queer criminality, so coming attractions for contemporary thought. These sorts of very political, very immediate, and very necessary discussions that are going on are directly related to philosophical discourses that have occurred.
I think one thing that I've always struggled with until I came to post-structuralist theory was a way to think, and here I basically mean Dullus and Gattari, is a way to think metaphysically about politics and just a way to think metaphysically about economics. And the whole problem of desire that they pose in Anti-Oedipus, especially today in what seems to be a complete resurgence of fascism in the United States, I think there's a lot of explanatory power in Deleuze and Guattari's work?
So I wrote my my master's thesis on Carl Schmitt and critical theory, and one of probably the central issue in British politics over the last few years has obviously been Brexit. And I found reading Schmitt and Chantal Mouffe's sort of commentaries on him to be a really, really effective way of trying to understand what was going on there. Maybe not, I don't want to go into too much detail, but broadly, Schmitt will say that we tend to think of this thing called liberal democracy as a sort of distinctive and isolated concept or theory. Now, what he's going to insist on is that actually we unpack that and distinguish between philosophy, so liberalism and democracy, as two distinctive and antagonistic ideas, essentially, and but in the form of liberal democracy, it's always in tension with itself and pushing in different directions. And under certain circumstances, one tendency will, come to the fore rather than the other. And there's always the risk that it will simply collapse into something else. And I felt that was largely what a lot of Brexit was about, in terms of, on the one hand, the liberal impulse towards representation, towards public debate, and the role of the third estate, and so on, and right procedures, and the rule of law as the final highest ideal, and on the other hand, democracy, which is much more to do with the expression of the will of the people directly, and that there's nothing higher than that, right? And I thought that was what was sort of seeming to be happening with the internal debates over Brexit at the time, was this conflict between Parliament and the people who had voted in a certain way, regardless of how I felt about that. And that I found Schmitt to be quite a useful way of sort of lens of thinking through these tensions within liberal democracy in some ways.
Okay, so the next question is from Sublation Cowboy Fuck 12, and I'm going to kind of piece it apart here. The first question, which I think is the one we're going into, is what insights do you think black metal theory has generated for engaging with necropolitics and or post-colonial theory? Also, there's more to the question, basically the relationship between Bataille and Dullus and Gattari to post-colonial approach to the Americas. We do have an episode on Bataille coming up, and there are definitely connections between Bataille and Deleuze and Guattari, especially as it relates to the concept of non-productive expenditure and anti-production, and how that relates to the economy. So I think there's going to be some work that we can do there that will answer the question. So here's the next question. This is from DTL.DWG. It says, your thoughts on how architects have appropriated Deleuze? And then he says, see Sanford Quinter, Manuel de Landa or Derrida, and Eisenman and Schumi.
I've watched and read a decent amount by de Landa specifically. And I will say just two things. Firstly, on the positive side, I found him hugely helpful, not only for understanding Deleuze and Guattari, partly because he's quite open. He will put right up front that his interpretation is in many ways a departure from what Deleuze and Guattari would have agreed to themselves, but also because he actually helped me understand a lot more about the history of mathematics and architecture and science, because he brings them all together in a really interesting way. So I appreciate him for that. On the negative side, I think it's precisely de Landa's stripping out the latent Marxism in Deleuze and Guattari's thought, which is the problem with de Landa's reading. Put it that way, you end up with a very kind of skeletal view, I guess, about what politics is and can be about. He ends up not far as I'm aware, not far off someone like William Connolly, who thinks that politics now is really just confined to voting, protests, making just decisions in a marketplace, education, and so on. So yeah, the other ones I'm afraid I can't speak to, other than that I do appreciate a lot of what de Landa does, and I think he's I find the way he connects up architecture with Deleuze and Guattari and other sort of scientific and social scientific disciplines really interesting too.
I think Deleuze and his relationship to architecture, specifically through Delanda, is interesting on the basis of complexity. And Deleuze is writing right at the end of sort of the brutalist era, which for, at least in the US, and Craig can speak to this, is sort of still the reigning architectural school when it comes to governmental buildings and anything financed by the state. But I do think when you see particular postmodern architectural trends, I can't help but see a little bit of Deleuze, but maybe I just read Deleuze into these things where I shouldn't. But again, I'm not an architecture student. If you want to look at an architecture student who was writing about Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, Foucault, Paul Preciado, their work, they were an architecture student that Derrida sent to the New School. So that's one place you could turn to. But yeah, I do see it. I see the influence, but I could just be reading it into the world around me.
Okay, so the next question is from Dr. Richard Waterloo. And it's kind of a long question, but I'll just kind of distill the important parts. They ask, how do people find their way out of postmodernism philosophically? And do philosophers that entertain the ideas eventually move on? And one of the lingering concerns they have relates to nihilism. They go on to say, I wonder if creating new ideas is actually good. It seems like new ideas are appropriated to cause destruction anyway. New philosophical ideas don't solve anything except the thinker or the writer's issues, whatever they may have been.
What's interesting about the question from Dr. Richard Waterloo is they start off with the mention of Robert Anton Wilson, who is most famous for the concept of a reality tunnel everyone filters through. And it's a very relativistic concept, but I don't know. It's something that I don't think that any of the people that are grouped under the term postmodernism really would buy into the full reality tunnel idea, because they wouldn't take positions incredibly substantial. They think there is a reality under this. They think there's something actively undermining the notions of objectivity and truth that modernity had held so dear and held so firm to, especially during the Enlightenment. And there is a reality, there is a truth here, but the truth is that these things are crumbling, they're being corroded, they are under threat, and this is something they take very seriously. Maybe some people like Deleuze and Guattari and the accelerationists think there's something emancipatory in this liberation from modernity, but there's also a sense in which there are some things that can be lost. I mean, I think the question also mentions it also mentioned Mark Fisher, and all of these thinkers, they problematize postmodernity as a real social phenomenon. And I don't think you can go beyond these thinkers grouped under the category of postmodern without going through the conditions that produced them. And if anything, some of these thinkers have proved incredibly well predictive, even in arguably some very self-undermining ways. So the Deleuzean Society of Control postscript, that is prophetic, if anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a sense in which you can group postmodernism under one heading, in a sense of, you can say, for example, if you take the definition of postmodernism given by Jean-François Lyotard and say that postmodernism is incredulity around meta-narratives, which meta-narratives were previously sort of stand-in for the worldview that constituted your sense of objectivity and meaning. You can say which there is still a meta-narrative of that. The meta-narrative that Jean-François Lyotard posits is that we have lost this sense in meta-narratives. This is a sort of a world's constituting trend, and you think it's been undermined by philosophical thought, yes, but you think it's mainly undermined by people like Wittgenstein. This isn't undermining of reality, it's proving that reality is more complicated than we think it is. And I don't think we can really go past the postmodernists until we've got past the problems they brought up. I think the problems, I disagree with the question 6, I think the problems are a bit more real, and maybe some concepts may not be the best at fixing those problems, but I think we can sort of do what sort of Samuel Beckett says and sort of learn to fail and fail better.
It's an understandable and reasonable question, and I think all of us will know so many people who've asked this, either to us or there's a better point in our lives where we've asked it ourselves. But the common thread I always find there is that when the person who asked this question, in general, the reason is that their first encounter has been with Baudrillard. It's almost always Baudrillard. And I think there's some reasons for that. I don't go too much detail here, but I think if you read someone like Deleuze, for example, Deleuze is making bold and objective claims about metaphysics. He is an out-and-out metaphysician, the structure of reality and the nature of thought and so on. And Derrida, he's often parodied as sort of as saying that we can just interpret a text any way we want, but Derrida, more than almost anyone else of his generation, was incredibly strict about the necessity of a really careful and close reading of an original text, for example. And that's hugely important for someone like Derrida. I will say, so I don't really think that there's such an issue. People, do postmodernists stick around for decades with this material? Yeah, they do. And I think Adam points to a lot of the reasons for that, which is that a lot of their claims seem to have been vindicated, at least in many cases. And so the question is, if their responses to those questions are inadequate, then we still need to show why and what a better answer might look like. And then I will say, then lastly, that I do have worries about the connection or lack thereof potentially between postmodern philosophy or postmodern political philosophy and actual political practice, what it actually looks like in reality. I mean, that's literally what I'm doing my PhD in, is I'm trying to work through that question, right? What is how does postmodernism or post-structuralism inform political practice in a way, right? So I think there are questions there, but even then it's more nuanced than simply, so Deleuze and Guattari in particular, right? Like those two in particular were really quite strongly indebted to Marx. So they're engaging with a history of philosophy, of a certain Western philosophical tradition, in the way that many of the best philosophers do. So I'm rambling a little bit now, but
no, this is good.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, is that once you start talking about post-structuralism, it's hard to make generalizations about them, because they're so diverse in many ways. Many of these thinkers. I mean, Derrida and Deleuze got along very well personally, but there's also lots of areas where their philosophies come into conflict. And there are questions about, what do we do with this material? And I think that's a fair question. What do we do in a political sense? Rather than just sort of stepping back and saying, oh, okay, well, it's all going to shit. Let's just, enjoy burning down, right? That's an open and valid question. That's something I'm trying to work through myself. But yeah, people do stick with it, and there's a lot of power in what they write. And it's not simply that truth is relative. Anything goes. The text doesn't. The text is an open text, whatever. So I think it's a valid question, but I think there's much more to it than it's being given credit for.
Just to round off that sort of what I was speaking about before, I think that postmodernist philosophy like Deleuze and Guattari and Fischer is great to go through, because, as we can see, there's an inherently practical sense to it. As Deleuze said in the Postscript on Society's Control, which I sort of praised earlier, which was, there is no need to fear or hope, but to look for new weapons. Towards the end of Mark Fisher's life, he was working on this practical concept of consciousness raising, which he derives from Marcuse and Deleuze and it's Guattari and Freud, and there is a practical element to this. I mean, I was just sort of looking around for stuff on the Nomadic War Machine on the internet the other day, and I found this video from a professor called Paul Watt, who's at Birkbeck, who's a geography teacher, and he's trying to use the Nomadic War Machine to model a way in which you could do anti-gentrification protests by taking over city sort of planning meetings and taking this very straight space off. You have to put your hand up and wait for your turn to speak, and just flattening it out, occupying it. So I think there is a very practical sense in which this sort of philosophy is oriented.
Maybe the bit that I'll add to it is, and I'll combine this response with a question offered by Prolitsucher. They have a name, I think it's in Dutch here, Ishaj. Their question is, to what extent can one speak of Deleuze and maybe even Deleuze and Guattari as post-structuralist or structuralist? And let's even bring in the term postmodernist here. My first thing is, ask yourself, what kind of work are those terms even doing? Postmodernism, post-structuralism. Are they terminating your reading or terminating your way of thinking about those thinkers in any in any way that's making them less meaningful for you. If that's the case, get rid of those terms, right? I mean, or at least put them off to the side, right? Because I think the definition of postmodernism, maybe even more so than post-structuralism, is very hotly contested. And there are multiple definitions of it. As far as being a post-structuralist is concerned, and how does it relate to Deleuze and Guattari? Maybe I'll just go right to the example. Think about the way that Guattari says there's no such thing as a language in itself, that there's no presupposed structure of language or any some such thing that we can call language that is a priori a thing, right? Now, that said, you can be like, now I know the definition of post-structuralism. It goes like this. It's been intimated through that example. The danger just comes back in. Find out the view, right? Like, where does that view take them? What does it mean to be a dominant language? How does the language change or evolve over time? How do languages interact or intersect with the economy, with finance, with skin and blood and stone? Like, this is what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get at in their political ontology, is how all of these things sort of mesh together. So in short, be careful of the terms. In fact, I would say get rid of them until you have a good sense of the views.
Although with Deleuze, I probably also recommend reading his essay, How Do You Recognize Structuralism?
Oh,
so can you see if he thought he was one?
Right.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert, but I was always under the impression that Deleuze in particular actually had quite a nuanced relationship with particularly the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. It's not simply a total critique from start to finish. I do think often that the terms themselves, like post-structuralism, is definitely preferable to postmodernism, right? It has fewer misunderstandings than that, but even then, I just tend to think that given the thinkers it tends to designate, Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, and so on. These thinkers often actually had not very much in common with each other in terms of the actual, in terms of their philosophical, contributions or systems or whatever. And there's much more diversity within these labels than is given credit for, and so that's why I think it can be dangerous still. Read Deleuze's essay on how to recognize it, and then also, I suspect that many of these writers, like Derrida as well, had a slightly more complex relationship with quote unquote structuralism than is often admitted, I suppose. Yeah.
And maybe one thing that I'll just add there is, watch the way that Deleuze develops a line of thought about intensities over the course of his career. And I just came off of reading his essay on Sade and masochism, in which he talks about Freud and Jung. And it's in the new book, the Letters and Textbook that just recently came out. And in that essay, you can see him make this move, talking about the way that the Freudian conception of desire differs from the Jungian conception of desire, insofar that Jung allows this more heterogeneous movement within his notion of the unconscious. Now, Deleuze, down the line in writing Anti-Oedipus and developing the concept of intensities, even breaks further from that, going beyond archetypes. In fact, in some ways, he subsumes the notion of archetypes to intensities, or at least puts it alongside it in a way that makes his concept of intensities even more expansive. And to me, in a way that allows for more explanatory power of the unconscious. And then, of course, Deleuze and Guattari formulating their own notion of the unconscious, which breaks it out of the brain. To me, it's about recognizing the moves more so than labeling them. We only have a few more questions left. Let's do this one. Talking about Deleuze and Guattari again. What did Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari find so vital in Antonin Artaud?
With Artaud, texts like To Have Done with the Judgment of God, it's about pushing things to their sort of limits, right? And one of the things I keep coming back to when it comes to Artaud and Deleuze is the schizophrenic table. Right? I'm sure Craig will know this example quite well. we have this table. I have my Focusrite on it. I've got my microphone, my stand, my computer, my Zoom call with my class on it, my books. Now I've got a cup, and I just keep stacking it inside. Is it not? And it starts to become sort of a different mess. The very way in which I begin to engage with this idea of the table sorts of as a multiplicity of things, as an assemblage of all of these different things and zones that I can engage with, things that I can do. I start to deal with it at the level of sort of the surface, but then I break it down. And Artaud is kind of doing that to the post-industrial era, and he's doing it to language, and he's breaking and obliterating these sorts of things in order to create sort of just pure intensities. So, of course, the answer with Artaud is the body without organs, right? I could just say, oh, well, look at the interview he gave after a brief airing of pieces of it on the radio, and he talks about trying to bring about a sort of body without organs. And, of course, Culp spoke about this in his interview with us, which, of course, if you haven't listened to it, you probably should. But with Artaud, I think it's about the explicit limit of the language in which he's been given, and how he toys with the exteriority of language, about the very ends of it. And that's why, and I know I'm struggling a little bit here, but that's why Foucault too in Madness and Civilization has a unique relationship with Artaud, because he sees Artaud as sort of the very hyper extension of rationalized discourse, the very alternative to it, the other side. It's sitting in the darkness. It is the unreason. Him and Nietzsche, they come in as people sort of embodying a space with conventional rationalist discourse can't translate. It doesn't have the tools to understand it. But if we just knew a little bit more about these alternative spaces, if we could move towards an unreason, then maybe we could understand Artaud. And with Deleuze, I think it's sort of similar, but different in the sense that he's pushing towards a limit, towards a breaking down, which I think that's the relationship with Antonin Artaud. And I'm sure Craig has a much better explanation than I do, but that's just my take.
No, I think that was fantastic. I would just add to that, of course, Deleuze and Guattari think he's vital in the sense that he is the most anti-Oedipal of the figures that they deal with.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry. I totally forgot.
No, I think that's an important thing to add, but it's also important to add for Deleuze and Guattari, Artaud is a cautionary tale. This is the story of somebody who went too far. He drove himself off a cliff mentally and physically in the pursuit of his art. And so basically going on this intensive revolution, the caution is this: do not go too far in our venture, right? Do not de-stratify too greatly. Do not de-Oedipalize to the point that you've compromised your entire life.
And I think that's the important thing with Deleuze and Guattari. Of course, there are some great political movements that come out of D&G, everything from, gender abolition, all of these wonderful movements. But then on the other side, right, there's this attempt to just say, oh, Deleuze and Guattari are just trying to sort of create sort of an empty, cold zone where all we have left is the exteriority and the outsideness of the world, and everything that we've built up around us has been reduced to this sort of cold, noumenal intensity. And I think the answer is no. They see sometimes a real functional value in some of these things. But what they don't want to do is see them as universals or natural things. They have a functionalist perspective on these things. They care not what Oedipus means, but what Oedipus does. They care not what mommy, daddy, sister, brother, boy, girl means, but what it does. So in a sense, these liberationist movements that take real inspiration from D&G, that's the creative aspect of it, the destructive creative aspect of it, the truly Nietzschean element. But with Artaud, they sort of show how he can fall out and find himself lost. And I just wanted to make sure that these sorts of readings of Deleuze and Guattari can be sometimes interesting, but the people who just reject them outright as like the psychiatrists and psychologists and psychoanalysts that did, at the release of Anti-Oedipus, I think sometimes it's just the result of a misinterpretation.
Here's an interesting question from Hugo, or it's probably pronounced Ugo. I think they're from South America, and they're often on our Twitter. And so, hello. Their question goes like this, and I'm going to kind of recast it. Basically, the concern is, it regards Chapter 3 of Deleuze's Difference and Repetition and the 9th series of Logic and Sense. And it's basically asking, how do we not fall into the dogmatic image of thought? How is it that we can live a problem, perceive the world without falling into the dogmatic image of thought? And what is its possible effect upon society? And I think the it here is maybe either being in it or being out of the dogmatic image of thought, at least as Deleuze construes it.
It's a tricky question, and I'm not sure if I can provide a properly satisfactory answer, to be honest with you. Other than that, firstly, it's a good question, and secondly, that it always takes me back to it's almost like a question of ideology, right? Which, of course, they reject that concept, but there the question is, for someone like Zizek, isn't it precisely when you come to believe that you have moved beyond ideology and that you've escaped it finally, that you have become most precise, most extremely, deep in ideology, essentially, right? That's the problem for someone like Zizek, and I suppose that's sort of in one sense, the problem here of enacting a non-dogmatic image of thought. And so maybe part of it, at least, is sort of a kind of conscious awareness of the way in which we're structured to and raised to think and act. And to do what we can to push against that, I suppose.
I think for me, and I get this a little bit from my reading of Guattari on transversality, taking that essay, the introduction to transversality, and taking Chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition, I think that escaping the image of thought first involves questioning all kinds of presuppositions like Deleuze does in Chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition. So the question is, how do we do that in other dimensions of our life? And just to go back to the original question, they're asking how this notion relates to things like research and educational practice. And so I'm thinking about my own work in education. I think it goes without saying that this is actually very hard to do. And I think any attempt that you make to try to think outside what we would call the image of thought is very difficult. I think the highly determined nature of the way that we just think about things in general makes this so hard. But I do think it's possible to get away from it by asking the right kinds of questions. For example, what are some presuppositions that I have, or some assumptions that I'm making about my students that might make it hard for me to engage them on a certain level? There's a whole slew of questions that I normally ask myself on a given day, whether it comes to preparing lessons or getting feedback from my students. But also, I'm questioning my own questions, right? Because sometimes, especially as a teacher, as an authority figure, if you put a question out there, people will craft their answers to please the question. Right. And so I have to think about how to ask questions in a way that allows other people to become unmoored from the image of thought, whatever that means. And I'm talking in very abstract terms here. But I think the important thing is maybe a more positive question is, how can we create the new? And so I think that question goes hand in hand with it. And so anytime I venture into any task, whether it's creating a podcast, for example, or new music, one of the important things that I do right from the start is open up this line of inquiry so that I kind of prime myself to actually create something new. All right, moving on. We only have a few more. Maybe this one's for Adam. So this is from Dead Triumvirate. Do you think that materialism and idealism exist in a strict dichotomy to one another? Or can pneuma, spiritual essence or being, in my description, that undergirds idealism blend with materialist foundations? Sounds like a nonsense question. I can clarify if necessary. They say, I don't know. I think that's a cool question.
No, it's pretty clear to me. Well, I think in any discussion about the idealism materialism distinction, you have to think about the very multiplicity of senses that the term materialism has been given, especially as well as idealism, because a lot of if you talk to a lot of Marxists, they use idealism to mean bad or just incorrect in general. And if you look at terms of the use of materialism, there's a sense in which it's meant negatively not idealism, but it also means in some senses particularity or multiplicity, where you look at things as a multiplicitous reality rather than subsuming them under one monolithic sort of concept. And there's also sort of the analytic philosophy sense in which sort of materialism is synonymous with an empiricism, but it's also synonymous with a kind of metaphysical, they would call it parsimony, I would call it austerity. From my perspective, I don't think you can read, I don't like keeping idealism and materialism in a completely distinct separation from each other. I think anytime you try to deal with kind of metaphysical or logical motion through any kind of material or contingent reality, you're doing something that someone could point out and say it's idealism. But there's a sense in which there's a kind of logic to how these things go. I mean, if you have a science of logic in a Hegelian sense or a logic of sense in the Deleuzean sense, I think logicism kind of reintegrates something of the idea into any sort of material, because materialism is an account of the world. An account has an intrinsic subject component into it. And I don't think it's something you can ever entirely eliminate. The ideas are, objects are embodied ideas in some sense. Labor embodies is a material action that embodies certain social relations as social realities, but also as subjective realities that we can become conscious of in these objects. And I really don't think you can separate idealism and materialism too much. I think if you can go too far on the one side and just sort of say there's no idea and it's all matter, but matter on its own is an incredibly abstract concept. It's only when we go through this process of thinking through these concepts and these immediacies that we can eventually get through to something more concrete, which is both, I think, a mixture of the ideal and the real. I don't believe in immediacy. like as Lukács said, immediacy is ideology. The given, it's not a thing. Everything is already mediated by systems of language and historical context and social relations. You just need to understand the reality of this mediation and how these ideas have been circulated and the material practices that goes around them. This is why Foucault is not a linguistic idealist. Discourse is a material practice, but it's material practice of ideas as embodied in in practice. I don't think you need to keep the ideal as a substrate outside of that. And in the same way, keeping the materials as a substrate, I think they can both be always already intertwining.
Thanks to everybody who submitted a question. Our upcoming episodes include Matt Colhoun, and we will be talking about the newly released compilation of lectures by Mark Fisher on post-capitalist desire by Repeater Books. We're all very excited to do that episode. Also, as promised, keeps getting put back, but it's coming soon, is our episode on Bataille. And we have plenty more scheduled for the rest of fall and winter. So please look forward to it. Support us on Patreon, Twitter, Instagram, buy some merchandise from us. Whatever you'd like to do to get involved, we would be very appreciative. Once again, thank you. This concludes our first Q&A. Answers Without Organs. We'll see you next time.